Alpha King paid for practical wife, but found woman who made him smile through chaos. Why would an Alpha King pay for a practical wife in the first place? And how could one woman become the reason he smiled through chaos? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with unforgettable characters and meaningful journeys, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new adventure. Thank you so much for watching, supporting the channel, and being part of this wonderful community. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, do you think a relationship that begins for practical reasons can grow into something genuine? Now, settle in, relax, and let us step into the beginning of this remarkable story together. A kingdom does not fall apart all at once. It begins with the little things everyone is too exhausted to notice. By 7 o'clock on a cold autumn morning, Blackwood Palace already sounded like a place losing its rhythm. Porcelain shattered somewhere inside the western dining hall. Two royal advisors argued so loudly over tax ledgers that their voices echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings. A young messenger hurried through the corridor carrying a stack of parchment almost 12 inches high before colliding with a servant balancing a silver tray of tea. Warm tea spread across polished marble while apologies filled the air faster than anyone could clean the mess. Nobody even stopped to help. They simply stepped around it and rushed toward their next emergency. The palace had become remarkably efficient at surviving chaos, but almost no one remembered what peace looked like anymore. At the center of it all stood Alpha King Ethan Ashford. He had already finished reviewing 3 military reports before sunrise, signed trade agreements from 4 neighboring territories, and settled a border dispute without raising his voice once. His crown rested perfectly upon dark hair untouched by disorder, and his black formal coat looked as immaculate as if someone had pressed every fold moments earlier. From the outside, he appeared exactly as every powerful ruler should. Calm. Precise. Unshakable. Yet, anyone who watched closely could notice something else. His untouched breakfast cooled beside him while page after page disappeared beneath his signature. The fresh bread remained exactly where the kitchen staff had placed it nearly 40 minutes earlier. Steam no longer rose from the coffee. Ethan had not noticed. He rarely noticed anymore. Across the enormous dining room, ministers continued discussing troop rotations, harvest forecasts, and diplomatic receptions scheduled weeks ahead. Every conversation demanded immediate attention. Every problem insisted it mattered most. Ethan listened, answered, approved, rejected, and moved on without hesitation. Efficiency had become second nature. Living had not. "Your Majesty?" the royal secretary asked cautiously. Ethan looked up only briefly. "The Eastern delegates have arrived an hour early. Move the meeting forward. The architect requests approval for the nursery renovation." Ethan paused for barely a heartbeat before replying. "Approve it." He signed another document without looking at it twice. The secretary hesitated again. "The nursery has remained unused for 5 years. Ethan's pen stopped moving for the first time that morning. Silence settled over the dining hall before he quietly answered, "Then perhaps it deserves sunlight again." Nobody responded. The ministers lowered their eyes, pretending to study maps that suddenly seemed fascinating. Everyone inside Blackwood Palace understood there were certain subjects that belonged to silence. Ethan slowly pushed his untouched breakfast aside and rose from the long oak table. He had no appetite, although he could not remember when that had become normal. As he crossed the dining hall, servants instinctively stepped aside, careful not to interrupt his steady pace. They respected him deeply. Some even admired him. Very few actually knew him. Beyond the towering windows, golden leaves drifted across the palace gardens while gardeners prepared flower beds for the coming winter. Ethan barely glanced outside before another advisor intercepted him with fresh reports requiring immediate attention. The king accepted them without complaint, adding yet another stack. Beneath his arm. Behind him, the abandoned breakfast remained exactly where it had been placed, untouched except for a small robin that landed outside the window and tilted its head curiously toward the empty chair. No one noticed the little bird. No one noticed the cold coffee. No one noticed that the man responsible for an entire kingdom had quietly forgotten how to care for himself long before anyone realized he needed someone willing to notice the things no report ever mentioned. By mid-morning, Ethan had crossed nearly every wing of Blackwood Palace without remembering a single hallway. His days followed the same pattern so faithfully that time itself seemed to disappear beneath endless responsibility. Council chamber. Military office. Treasury. Audience hall. Private study. Every room contained another decision that only the Alpha King could make. Every face carried another expectation. Every conversation began with the kingdom and ended with another burden added quietly to his shoulders. The strange part was that no one questioned whether he was tired. They simply assumed a king never was. The Grand Council chamber buzzed with controlled urgency as ministers arranged maps across the polished walnut table. Colored pins marked trade routes, neighboring territories, and villages preparing for the coming winter. Ethan listened while Chancellor Marcus Holloway outlined grain shortages in the northern provinces. Before Marcus finished speaking, another advisor interrupted with concerns about diplomatic guests arriving before the Harvest Moon Festival. A third reminded the king that 3 noble families still awaited personal audiences regarding inheritance disputes. Ethan absorbed every word with remarkable precision, answering each question without raising his voice. He never hesitated. He never complained. Yet as the meeting continued, his gaze occasionally drifted toward the tall windows where autumn sunlight danced across the gardens outside. Children from the palace staff chased one another beneath ancient maple trees while gardeners paused long enough to smile at them. The scene lasted only seconds before another report pulled Ethan back into duty. Somewhere inside him, a quiet part wondered why laughter always seemed to exist just beyond the rooms where he spent his days. When the final minister concluded his presentation, Marcus remained standing instead of gathering his papers. Ethan noticed immediately. Marcus had served the royal family for over 25 years. He rarely lingered without reason. "There is something else," Marcus said carefully. Ethan leaned back slightly. "Go on." The elderly chancellor folded his hands together before speaking. "The council has reached a unanimous recommendation regarding the future stability of the crown." Ethan already knew where the conversation was headed. He had heard different versions of it for nearly 3 years. "You believe I should marry?" Marcus nodded with quiet respect rather than enthusiasm. "The kingdom needs certainty, Your Majesty. Our allies ask who will stand beside the throne. Noble houses continue presenting proposals. They believe a queen would strengthen confidence throughout every territory." Ethan walked slowly toward the window overlooking the gardens below. Fallen leaves drifted across winding stone paths while 2 stable boys laughed over something only they understood. Their carefree voices floated upward before fading into the autumn breeze. "They are asking for a queen," Ethan murmured. "They are asking for reassurance," Marcus corrected gently. Silence stretched comfortably between them. Marcus had known Ethan since he was barely older than the palace pages now delivering messages through these halls. He recognized the loneliness hidden beneath disciplined routine, though he never dared speak of it directly. At last Ethan rested one hand against the cool glass. "Do they believe marriage solves disorder?" Marcus offered a faint smile. "Not always. But sometimes the right person changes the atmosphere of an entire home." Ethan considered those words longer than expected. He thought about the untouched breakfast waiting somewhere in the dining hall. He thought about rooms that had grown quieter each passing year. He thought about how even the palace clocks seemed louder lately. None of those problems required romance. They required presence. Someone who noticed empty chairs before meetings began. Someone who remembered meals before they turned cold. Someone who could restore ordinary moments that power alone could never command. Ethan slowly turned back toward the council table, his expression calm once again. "If the kingdom believes I need a wife," he said evenly, "then perhaps it is time they understand exactly what kind of wife I intend to find." The official announcement appeared on every palace bulletin board before sunrise the following morning. Messengers carried sealed copies to neighboring territories while town criers repeated its words across busy market squares where merchants paused in the middle of their morning business to listen. Noble families expected another traditional royal courtship. Instead, they heard something no one had imagined. The Alpha King was not searching for beauty, wealth, prestigious bloodlines, or political advantage. He sought a practical wife. The phrase spread through the kingdom faster than the autumn wind. By noon, people debated its meaning inside bakeries, blacksmith shops, libraries, and crowded cafes. Some laughed, convinced the notice was a misunderstanding. Others believed it was a clever strategy to avoid pressure from ambitious noble houses. Yet every official document carried the royal seal, leaving no room for doubt. The requirements were astonishingly simple. Candidates needed honesty, sound judgment, patience, and the ability to manage a busy household. They were expected to remain calm during unexpected situations, communicate respectfully with palace staff, and value kindness above appearances. There was no mention of beauty. No mention of noble ancestry. No mention of wealth. At the very bottom of the announcement appeared one final sentence that puzzled almost everyone who read it. The purpose of this marriage is stability, partnership, and mutual respect. Nothing more. Inside Blackwood Palace, the council chamber erupted into quiet disbelief. Several younger advisors exchanged uncertain glances while Chancellor Marcus Holloway calmly folded the announcement and placed it on the polished oak table. "Your Majesty," one nobleman finally asked, "should we not include expectations regarding royal ceremonies, public appearances, or diplomatic responsibilities?" Ethan remained seated beside the tall windows overlooking the eastern courtyard. Sunlight reflected across stacks of reports waiting for his attention, yet for once he left them untouched. "Those responsibilities can be learned," he answered evenly. "Character cannot." Another advisor cleared his throat. "Many influential families may feel overlooked." Ethan looked toward him with calm silver eyes. "Then they are welcome to overlook this opportunity as well." No one argued further. The discussion quietly ended, but uncertainty lingered throughout the room long after the ministers departed. Outside the council chamber, palace servants soon discovered another unusual detail. Expensive jewelry had been removed from the reception room prepared for future meetings. Elaborate floral displays disappeared. Even the formal golden chairs usually reserved for royal introductions had been replaced by simple wooden seating beside a bright window overlooking the gardens. Ethan had ordered fresh flowers from the greenhouse instead of imported arrangements and requested tea, homemade bread, and warm soup rather than extravagant banquets. When the head steward questioned the simpler preparations, the king replied with only one sentence. "If someone feels uncomfortable sharing ordinary moments with me, extraordinary ones will not matter." That afternoon Ethan stood alone inside the reception room after everyone else had left. The quiet space felt strangely unfamiliar without layers of ceremony surrounding it. A single round table rested near the window with 4 plain chairs placed around it. Fresh white daisies stood inside a small ceramic vase. Their simple fragrance reminded him of childhood afternoons spent outdoors before royal duty consumed every hour of his life. He reached down and absent-mindedly adjusted one flower leaning toward the sunlight. The movement surprised even him. It had been years since he had noticed something so small. Beyond the glass, palace employees crossed the courtyard carrying baskets of laundry, fresh vegetables, and bundles of firewood as another ordinary day continued. Somewhere among thousands of people living within his kingdom, a woman who had never imagined becoming queen was unknowingly walking toward a future neither of them could yet see, while the palace prepared for interviews unlike any royal court had ever witnessed. Emily Carter almost missed the announcement entirely. She had arrived at the village market shortly after 8 o'clock carrying 2 woven baskets, one filled with fresh bread from the bakery where she worked every Thursday morning and the other holding jars of blackberry preserves promised to Mrs. Henderson across town. Autumn air carried the comforting scent of cinnamon, apples, and burning firewood while neighbors greeted one another by name along the busy streets. Emily liked mornings like these because ordinary routines made life feel dependable. She believed people revealed their true character during simple moments far more often than during extraordinary ones. After delivering the bread, she noticed a small crowd gathered around the public notice board beside the old stone fountain. Curious voices floated through the crisp air. Some laughed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Only the Alpha King could ask something like that, one merchant chuckled. No princesses, another woman whispered. No noble families? Emily stepped closer, balancing her baskets carefully while waiting for the crowd to thin. She had no interest in royal gossip, but she disliked leaving questions unanswered. When the final group wandered away, she quietly read every line posted beneath the royal seal. Practical wife. Partnership. Mutual respect. Household management. Kindness. Emily read the announcement twice before folding the shopping list tucked inside her apron and slipping it back into her pocket. She neither laughed nor sighed. She simply tilted her head thoughtfully. That sounds lonely, she murmured almost to herself. The elderly flower seller arranging bouquets nearby glanced up with a curious smile. Everyone else sees a king searching for a wife, she said. You see loneliness? Emily looked back toward the notice. Someone who writes requirements like these is probably tired of pretending everything is fine. The flower seller studied her for a long moment before handing her a single white daisy. Take this, she said warmly. You notice unusual things. Emily accepted the flower with quiet gratitude, thanked the woman, and continued toward Mrs. Henderson's cottage. She gave no further thought to the announcement because her own day remained pleasantly ordinary. The Henderson fence still needed repairing before winter. Mrs. Lewis from the bakery had been forgetting her afternoon medicine. Young Tommy across the lane still insisted his socks disappeared because squirrels borrowed them. Emily smiled every time she remembered that explanation. By late afternoon she arrived at her small rented cottage tucked beside a narrow creek just beyond the village. The home contained little more than a kitchen, one bedroom, and shelves filled with carefully labeled notebooks. Every notebook held practical observations collected over the years. Grocery budgets. Seasonal recipes. Household schedules. Gardening reminders. Birthday dates for neighbors who had no close family. Emily enjoyed organizing small details because she believed they made difficult days easier for everyone around her. As she unpacked the baskets, someone knocked gently on the front door. Standing outside was Mrs. Henderson wrapped in her familiar knitted shawl, holding the royal announcement folded neatly beneath one arm. Emily, she began with an amused smile, I have been thinking all afternoon. Emily laughed softly. That usually means you are about to ask me for something unexpected. Mrs. Henderson nodded without embarrassment. The palace is looking for someone practical. She carefully placed the announcement on the kitchen table between them. And I have never met anyone more practical than you. Emily looked from the paper to the older woman before quietly shaking her head with an affectionate smile. I think they are searching for someone very different. Mrs. Henderson only smiled wider as sunlight faded beyond the cottage window. Sometimes, she said gently, the right person is exactly the one who believes they are not. The person anyone is searching for. The following Tuesday, Emily arrived at Blackwood Palace carrying only a small leather satchel, a neatly folded notebook, and the same calm expression she wore while organizing pantry shelves or repairing loose fence posts back home. She had almost turned around twice during the 2-hour carriage ride, quietly convincing herself that someone else would certainly be better suited for a royal interview. Yet Mrs. Henderson's gentle words had lingered in her thoughts all morning. Sometimes the right person is exactly the one who believes they are not the person anyone is searching for. The palace gates rose high above her as they slowly opened, revealing broad stone courtyards, towering fountains, and elegant gardens dressed in the warm colors of late autumn. Everything looked grand without appearing welcoming. Servants hurried between buildings carrying ledgers, flower arrangements, trays of polished silver, and carefully folded linens. Everyone seemed busy. Everyone seemed to be walking just a little too fast. Emily quietly stepped aside when she noticed two young pages struggling to lift a heavy wooden crate filled with kitchen supplies. Without saying a word, she placed her satchel on a nearby bench and helped steady one side until they safely reached the pantry entrance. The boys thanked her with surprised smiles before racing off toward their next task. Emily dusted her hands together, picked up her satchel, and continued toward the reception hall as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside, nearly 24 women already waited for their scheduled interviews. Some wore elegant gowns embroidered with silver thread. Others carried family crests proudly stitched onto velvet sleeves. Several practiced graceful introductions beneath their breath while attendants offered refreshments on polished trays. Emily looked down at her simple blue dress and sensible walking shoes before quietly choosing the chair nearest the window rather than joining conversations already filling the room. Through the glass she noticed one of the palace gardeners kneeling beside a flower bed, gently supporting a broken sunflower with a thin wooden stake so it could remain standing a little longer before winter arrived. She smiled at the small act of care. Moments later, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the reception hall. A young servant had accidentally dropped a tray stacked with porcelain teacups. Cups rolled across the polished floor while hot tea splashed dangerously close to expensive dresses. Several candidates stepped backward immediately, worried about stains reaching their clothing. Attendants rushed to gather the broken pieces, apologizing repeatedly. Emily did not hesitate. She quietly walked over, found a nearby towel resting on a serving cart, and knelt to help absorb the spilled tea before anyone slipped on the smooth marble floor. "Are you burned?" she asked the embarrassed servant first instead of looking at the broken dishes. The young woman blinked in surprise before softly answering, "No, ma'am." Emily smiled with visible relief. "Good. Cups can be replaced." Together they finished cleaning the floor within minutes. The servant thanked her again before hurrying away with reddened cheeks. Emily returned the towel, washed her hands at a nearby basin, and calmly resumed her seat beside the window. None of the noble candidates spoke to her afterward. A few looked puzzled. Others appeared quietly amused that someone attending a royal interview had spent her first moments cleaning spilled tea. Emily noticed none of it. She simply opened her notebook and began reviewing a handwritten checklist she had prepared during the journey. The first page contained no plans for impressing a king, no carefully rehearsed answers, and no reminders about royal etiquette. Instead, the neatly written list began with 3 simple questions. Does he eat breakfast while it is still warm? Does he sleep enough to think clearly? Does anyone remember to ask how he is doing before asking what he needs to do? As the afternoon sunlight drifted slowly across the reception room, the palace steward finally opened the carved oak doors and quietly announced that the next candidate would now meet the Alpha King. When the palace steward called Emily Carter's name, several women in the reception hall looked up with quiet surprise. A few searched their memories, trying to recall the family crest she represented. There was none. Others glanced toward her simple blue dress before returning their attention to jeweled sleeves and embroidered gowns they believed belonged in a royal palace. Emily rose calmly, slipped her small notebook into her satchel, and thanked the steward with a warm smile before following him through a series of long stone corridors washed in late afternoon sunlight. The farther they walked, the quieter the palace became. The hurried footsteps, distant conversations, and clattering dishes slowly faded until only the steady ticking of an old grandfather clock accompanied them. At last the steward stopped before a pair of carved oak doors and gently pushed one open. "His Majesty will see you now." Emily stepped inside without rushing. The reception room looked nothing like she had imagined. There were no towering throne platforms or glittering chandeliers demanding attention. Instead, a round wooden table stood beside a wide window overlooking the palace gardens. Fresh white daisies rested inside a simple ceramic vase, their petals glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. 4 plain chairs surrounded the table, and a tray holding warm tea, fresh bread, and butter waited quietly in the center. The room felt less like a royal audience chamber and more like a peaceful place where honest conversations could happen. Ethan Ashford stood near the window with one hand resting lightly against the chair beside him. He turned as Emily entered, studying her with the same calm attention he had given every candidate that week. Yet before either of them spoke, his eyes briefly noticed something unusual. Emily's first glance had not settled on the crown resting upon his head. Instead, she looked toward the untouched tea tray. The steam had nearly disappeared from the teapot. Without realizing she had spoken aloud, Emily murmured softly, "That tea has been waiting a while." Ethan blinked once. It was not the greeting he expected. Most candidates complimented the palace, praised the kingdom, or nervously rehearsed prepared introductions. No one had ever noticed the tea. First, Emily immediately realized she had spoken out of turn and offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, Your Majesty." Ethan gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit." She thanked him and took her seat with quiet confidence, placing her satchel neatly beside the chair instead of on the polished table. For a few moments neither of them spoke. Outside the window, gardeners carefully gathered fallen leaves into woven baskets while a pair of robins hopped between the flower beds searching for seeds before sunset. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Most people seem nervous when they meet me." Emily considered the question honestly rather than quickly. "I was nervous on the carriage ride." Ethan waited. "What changed?" She looked at him with calm blue eyes that carried neither fear nor admiration. "You look tired." The words settled gently into the quiet room. Ethan remained completely still. No one had answered him that way in years. Advisors described him as capable. Soldiers called him fearless. Nobles praised his discipline. Foreign rulers respected his strength. Yet this woman, whom he had met less than 2 minutes earlier, had somehow looked beyond every title in the room and noticed the one thing everyone else had stopped seeing. Emily immediately wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake. "I did not mean disrespect," she said softly. "Only, people who carry too much often forget to rest." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the untouched tea before a quiet sound escaped him. It was small, almost uncertain, as though he had forgotten how it felt. Then, without warning, the corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile. It lasted only a moment, but outside the half-open door, the palace steward froze in complete disbelief. He had served Blackwood Palace for nearly 15 years, and he could not remember the last time he had seen the Alpha King smile during an official interview. The faint smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, yet its quiet warmth lingered in the room long after Ethan's expression returned to calm. Emily noticed it only because she happened to be looking at him when it arrived. She did not react or point it out. Some moments deserved the kindness of being left undisturbed. Ethan slowly reached for the teapot resting between them and poured fresh tea into 2 simple porcelain cups. The tea had cooled enough to drink comfortably, though it was no longer as warm as it should have been. He placed 1 cup before Emily before taking the seat across from her. For the first time that week, the interview no longer felt like an interview. It felt like 2 people sharing an ordinary conversation. "Tell me about yourself," Ethan said. Emily wrapped both hands around the warm cup before answering. "There is not very much to tell." Ethan waited patiently. She smiled. "I enjoy organizing homes. I like gardens that bloom in every season, kitchens where everyone knows where the flour is kept, and calendars that help people remember birthdays." Ethan tilted his head with quiet curiosity. "Birthdays?" Emily nodded. "People feel less alone when someone remembers small things." The answer settled gently between them. Ethan realized he could not remember the last time anyone had spoken about ordinary life without trying to impress him. Most conversations around the palace revolved around strategies, ceremonies, alliances, and responsibilities. Emily spoke about warm bread, flower gardens, forgotten birthdays, and tidy cupboards as though they were equally worthy of attention. Somehow, they were. Ethan glanced toward the notebook partially visible inside her satchel. "You carry notes with you?" Emily laughed softly. "Always." "May I ask why?" She reached into the satchel and carefully placed the worn notebook on the table. The leather cover showed years of careful use, its corners softened by countless afternoons spent inside kitchens, markets, and small cottages. People think organization is about making lists, she explained. For me, it is about making life easier for someone else. Ethan looked toward her with genuine interest. Emily opened the notebook to several neatly written pages filled with careful handwriting. One page contained weekly meal plans designed to reduce wasted food. Another listed neighbors who preferred morning visits because afternoons became difficult for them. Another held reminders to rotate blankets before winter so everyone received the warmest ones first. Ethan slowly turned another page after she quietly nodded permission. Every line reflected thoughtfulness rather than perfection. There were no grand ambitions written inside. Only practical ways to make ordinary days a little kinder. He closed the notebook carefully before returning it to her. Most applicants brought recommendations from influential families, he observed. Emily slipped the notebook back into her satchel. I brought habits instead. Ethan could not explain why those 4 words stayed with him more powerfully than every polished speech he had heard all week. Outside the reception room, the palace steward remained standing near the half-open doorway with 2 attendants waiting beside him. None of them intended to eavesdrop, yet they could not ignore the unusual silence inside. Previous interviews had ended quickly with formal questions and predictable answers. This conversation continued without raised voices, awkward pauses, or rehearsed compliments. One young attendant whispered, "Has anyone called for the next candidate?" The steward quietly shook his head. Nearly 45 minutes had passed. No one had ever remained inside this room that long. Back at the table, Ethan noticed sunlight slowly shifting across the windowsill until it reached the vase of white daisies. One flower had begun leaning toward the fading light. Before thinking, Emily gently rotated the vase so every blossom could receive the remaining warmth of the afternoon. She apologized immediately afterward. I hope you do not mind. Flowers always seem happier when they face the sun. Ethan looked at the simple bouquet, then back at the woman sitting across from him. Once again, she had quietly noticed something everyone else would have walked past without a second thought. And for reasons he could not yet understand, the room no longer felt quite as empty as it had that morning. By the time Emily finally left the reception room, the palace hallways had already begun filling with evening light. Golden rays stretched across polished stone floors while servants quietly lit lanterns one by one along the corridors. The palace steward escorted her to the front entrance with remarkable politeness, though he found himself glancing at her several times along the way. He had welcomed hundreds of distinguished guests into Blackwood Palace over the years, yet he could not remember another visitor who had left the Alpha King sitting silently beside a vase of daisies long after an interview had ended. Emily thanked the steward warmly before stepping outside into the cool autumn air. She believed the meeting had gone reasonably well, although she doubted she would ever receive another invitation. She had answered honestly instead of impressively. Sometimes honesty was enough. Sometimes it was not. As her carriage rolled slowly through the palace gates, she looked back only once before opening her notebook and quietly writing a single sentence beneath that day's date. He needs someone who reminds him that ordinary moments matter. She closed the notebook and smiled faintly at the thought before turning her attention to the changing colors of the countryside beyond the road. Meanwhile, inside Blackwood Palace, Ethan remained seated in the reception room long after the final candidate had departed. The untouched reports waiting in his study remained exactly where they had been left. For perhaps the first time in years, deadlines had stopped demanding every corner of his attention. His eyes rested on the small vase of white daisies Emily had carefully turned toward the afternoon sun. The flowers now stood straighter than before, their pale petals catching the last warm light filtering through the window. It was such a small gesture. Almost insignificant. Yet somehow the room itself felt different because of it. A quiet knock sounded at the door before Chancellor Marcus Holloway stepped inside carrying another stack of official documents. He paused immediately after noticing the king still sitting beside the empty teacups. The final reports from the northern provinces have arrived, Your Majesty. Ethan nodded absently but made no move toward the papers. Marcus placed them carefully upon the nearby table before studying the room with experienced eyes. "You have not returned to your study." Ethan glanced toward the window where evening birds crossed the orange sky above the palace gardens. "No." Marcus followed his gaze before noticing the slightly rotated flower vase. It seemed like an odd detail to capture anyone's attention, yet somehow it did. The interview lasted considerably longer than expected, the Chancellor observed. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the arm of his chair. "She noticed things no one else noticed." Marcus smiled knowingly. "That appears to have been your intention." Ethan considered the thought before quietly answering, "I believed I was searching for someone capable of managing a household." He looked once more at the warm cup Emily had barely touched. "Instead, I met someone who quietly improved a room she had no reason to care about." Marcus remained silent, sensing the king had not finished. "Every other candidate described how they would support the crown," Ethan continued. "She never mentioned the crown once." The old chancellor folded his hands together with quiet satisfaction. Perhaps she was looking at the man wearing it. Ethan did not respond immediately. Somewhere beyond the open window came the distant laughter of palace staff finishing another day's work before returning home to their families. He realized he had listened to that sound instead of ignoring it. Even stranger, he had smiled again while remembering a woman who spoke about birthdays, warm bread, and flowers facing the sun. As twilight settled gently over Blackwood Palace, Ethan rose from his chair and reached for the untouched reports waiting beside the door. Then he paused, turned back toward the little vase of white daisies, and carefully moved it a few inches closer to the fading sunlight, repeating without realizing it the same quiet act of kindness Emily had shown only an hour before. The next morning, a sealed envelope bearing the royal crest arrived at Emily's cottage just as she finished watering the small herb garden behind her kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron before accepting it from the palace courier, who offered a respectful bow and departed without another word. Emily stood quietly beneath the old maple tree beside her porch, studying the elegant seal for several moments before carefully opening the letter. Inside, only a few neatly written lines appeared. The Alpha King requested a second meeting at Blackwood Palace 3 days later. No explanation followed. No ceremony was mentioned. Simply a date, a time, and a sincere expression of gratitude for her previous visit. Emily read the letter twice before folding it carefully and slipping it inside her notebook. She felt neither excitement nor disappointment. Instead, she found herself wondering whether the king had remembered to finish the breakfast that had grown cold on his table. The thought made her smile despite herself. Over the following 3 days she returned to her ordinary routine as though nothing unusual had happened. She helped Mrs. Lewis organize the bakery before dawn, repaired loose shelves inside the village library, and spent one afternoon teaching young Tommy how to sew the missing button back onto his favorite coat after discovering the squirrels had never been responsible for its disappearance after all. Life continued in its familiar rhythm, and Emily appreciated that. She believed extraordinary moments only carried meaning because ordinary days existed between them. Meanwhile, inside Blackwood Palace, Ethan discovered that ordinary routines no longer felt exactly the same. On the first morning after the interviews, he reached automatically for another report before noticing a tray waiting beside his desk. Fresh bread. Warm coffee. Sliced apples. He paused, remembering Emily's quiet observation about cold tea. Instead of continuing to read while ignoring the meal, he closed the report, sat beside the window, and finished breakfast before beginning work. The palace servants exchanged surprised glances without saying a word. On the second morning, Ethan stopped beside the greenhouse while crossing the eastern courtyard. The elderly gardener looked up in astonishment as the king quietly asked whether the white daisies in the reception room had enough sunlight during autumn afternoons. The gardener assured him they did before watching the Alpha King continue toward the council wing with an expression of complete confusion. On the third morning, Chancellor Marcus Holloway entered the king's study carrying another stack of documents and immediately noticed something different. The breakfast tray was empty. The window stood open, allowing crisp autumn air to drift through the room, and the vase of white daisies now rested permanently beside the desk instead of the distant reception room. Marcus placed the reports down before smiling to himself. "Your Majesty appears to have developed new habits." Ethan glanced briefly toward the flowers. "Perhaps I simply noticed old ones." Marcus chuckled softly but said nothing more. Later that afternoon, while reviewing correspondence, Ethan unexpectedly found his attention wandering toward a single question that no official report could answer. Was Emily Carter simply kind to everyone, or had she somehow seen something in him that even he had stopped recognizing? He realized the second meeting was no longer about selecting a suitable wife for the kingdom. It had quietly become an opportunity to understand the woman who had altered his daily life without making a single promise, giving a single speech, or asking for anything in return, and for the first time in many years, Ethan noticed himself looking forward to a future appointment rather than merely preparing for another obligation. 3 days later, Emily returned to Blackwood Palace beneath a clear autumn sky brushed with pale gold clouds drifting slowly across the horizon. The familiar carriage rolled through the front gates just after 9 o'clock, and this time the guards greeted her with warm smiles instead of curious glances. Word traveled quietly inside great palaces, and everyone remembered the young woman who had somehow persuaded the Alpha King to smile without trying. Emily noticed little changes the moment she stepped inside. The same servant who had dropped the tray of teacups during her first visit now moved through the hallway with greater confidence. Fresh flowers brightened windowsills that had stood empty only days before. Even the hurried footsteps echoing through the corridors seemed steadier, as though the palace itself had taken one long, calming breath. She followed the steward toward the reception room once again, but before reaching the carved oak doors they passed the royal library. Through the half-open entrance Emily caught sight of Ethan standing beside an enormous bookshelf, reading quietly while morning sunlight spilled across polished wooden floors. He had removed his formal ceremonial cloak, wearing only a simple dark jacket over a crisp white shirt. Without layers of royal ceremony surrounding him, he looked less like an untouchable ruler and more like a man who had finally allowed himself a moment of stillness. Ethan looked up almost immediately, noticing her reflection in the library window before the steward even announced her arrival. A genuine smile, small but unmistakable, crossed his face. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Emily returned the smile naturally. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Ethan closed the book resting in his hands. "Would you mind changing our plans?" Emily tilted her head with quiet curiosity. "Not at all. I have spent enough hours sitting across tables this week." His silver eyes drifted toward the palace gardens outside the tall windows. "Would you walk with me instead?" Emily nodded without hesitation. A few minutes later they followed winding stone paths through gardens glowing with late autumn colors. Towering maple trees scattered golden leaves across neatly trimmed lawns while cool breezes carried the faint scent of rosemary, cedar, and freshly turned earth. Gardeners paused respectfully as the king passed, though several exchanged surprised glances after noticing he had dismissed every advisor waiting to accompany him. The two of them walked without urgency. They did not discuss treaties, ceremonies, or politics. Instead, Ethan asked Emily which season she preferred. "Autumn," she answered after a moment's thought. "Most people expect spring." Emily gently brushed one fallen maple leaf away from the garden path so no one would slip later. "Spring reminds us life begins again. Autumn reminds us it is all right to let some things rest." Ethan considered the answer quietly. "You seem to notice lessons hidden inside ordinary things." Emily smiled toward the tree swaying gently above them. "I think ordinary things are where most lessons live." They continued walking until reaching a quiet stone bench overlooking a small pond where ducks drifted peacefully across still water. Ethan noticed Emily watching the ducks with genuine interest before opening the notebook she always carried. She wrote only one short sentence before closing it again. Curious, Ethan asked, "May I know what you wrote this time?" Emily laughed softly. "Only an observation." "May I hear it?" She hesitated for just a second before answering honestly. "I wrote that you smiled before you realized you were smiling." Ethan stood completely still. He searched his memory and realized she was right. The smile had appeared the moment he saw her standing outside the library, long before duty, expectation, or careful self-control had returned. No council member had ever pointed out such a simple truth. No noble had ever noticed. Emily had observed it almost effortlessly, and in that quiet moment beside the autumn pond, Ethan finally understood something that had escaped him for years. She was not changing his palace because she intended to. She was changing it simply by paying attention to the things everyone else had forgotten to see. They remained beside the quiet pond until the afternoon sun began drifting lower across the gardens, painting the water in soft shades of amber and gold. Neither Ethan nor Emily seemed eager to interrupt the peaceful silence that had settled naturally between them. It was not the uncomfortable silence of strangers searching for the right words. It was the quiet companionship of two people discovering they did not always need words to understand one another. At last Ethan spoke, his voice carrying a thoughtful sincerity Emily had not heard before. "May I ask you something that has nothing to do with this interview?" Emily smiled gently. "Of course." He folded his hands loosely behind his back as they resumed walking along the winding stone path. "When you read the announcement, why did you decide to come?" Emily did not answer immediately. She watched a family of sparrows hopping beneath an old oak tree before quietly replying, "At first, I did not intend to." Ethan looked at her with curiosity. "What changed your mind?" She laughed softly, remembering the conversation inside her little cottage. "An elderly neighbor told me that sometimes people ask for one thing when their heart quietly needs another." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. "And what did you believe I needed?" Emily hesitated only because she wanted her answer to be honest without sounding unkind. "I thought." She searched for the gentlest words she could find. "I thought you looked like someone who had become very good at taking care of everyone except yourself." The breeze carried a handful of golden leaves across the path between them. Ethan watched them drift slowly toward the pond before speaking again. "Most people see the crown first." Emily smiled. "Crowns are easy to notice." "And what do you notice?" She looked toward him with calm blue eyes that never seemed interested in titles. "Whether someone remembers to eat while their food is warm. Whether they have slept enough to think clearly. Whether they smile because they are happy or because everyone expects them to." Ethan felt those simple observations settle somewhere deep inside him. They sounded ordinary. Yet no royal advisor had ever asked such questions. They measured life differently than power ever could. They reached the greenhouse where rows of late-blooming flowers filled the warm glass house with the gentle scent of earth and fresh blossoms. The elderly gardener looked up with surprise before offering respectful bows to both of them. Ethan paused beside the bed of white daisies. "These are the same flowers from the reception room," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "They seem happiest here." The gardener smiled to himself before excusing his presence, sensing they wished to continue alone. Ethan carefully picked up a small watering can resting nearby and instinctively reached toward one of the flower beds. Then he stopped. "I have no idea how much water they actually need." Emily accepted the watering can with a quiet laugh. "Too much kindness can drown flowers just as easily as too little." She poured only a small amount around each stem before handing the can back to him. "They need consistency more than abundance." Ethan repeated the motion exactly as she had shown him, moving carefully from one blossom to the next. The task lasted barely a minute, yet something about it felt strangely peaceful. Emily watched him finish before saying softly, "You learn quickly." Ethan smiled again, this time without realizing it. The gardener noticed from across the greenhouse and quietly pretended to focus on trimming rose bushes instead of staring at the impossible sight before him. As they stepped back onto the garden path, Ethan found himself understanding a truth that no council meeting, political alliance, or royal ceremony had ever taught him. Emily had never tried to become queen. She had never tried to impress the Alpha King. She simply carried the rare habit of making every place she entered feel a little lighter than when she arrived, and somewhere between forgotten breakfasts, white daisies, and ordinary conversations, Ethan realized he was no longer searching for someone to help manage a palace. He was quietly hoping one remarkable woman might choose to remain inside it. The return journey felt much quieter than the one before. As the carriage rolled away from Blackwood Palace beneath a sky painted in soft shades of lavender and gold, Emily rested her notebook on her lap without opening it. She watched rows of maple trees glide past the window while cool evening light settled gently across the countryside. Her thoughts lingered on the day's conversations, not because the Alpha King had spoken like a ruler, but because, for the first time, she had seen someone trying to remember how to simply live instead of endlessly perform a role. When she finally reached her cottage, the familiar creak of the wooden gate and the comforting scent of rosemary greeted her like old friends. Nothing had changed. The kettle still rested beside the stove. The small herb garden still waited for tomorrow's watering. The worn rocking chair beside the fireplace remained exactly where she had left it. Emily smiled quietly, grateful that ordinary places always welcomed people without asking them to become someone else. The following morning, she resumed her routine before sunrise, kneading bread dough beside Mrs. Lewis at the bakery while listening to neighbors exchange stories about harvests, grandchildren, and changing weather. She never mentioned the palace. She never mentioned the king. Meanwhile, inside Blackwood Palace, Ethan entered his study carrying a leather folder prepared by Chancellor Marcus Holloway. Inside rested the official marriage agreement drafted according to the council's recommendations. Every page had been carefully written by royal legal advisors. The arrangement would last 1 year before either party could renew or respectfully conclude it. Financial responsibilities, household duties, public appearances, and ceremonial obligations had all been listed with remarkable precision. Ethan read every page slowly before closing the folder without signing it. Something felt incomplete. The document described responsibilities perfectly. It said nothing about kindness. It measured schedules, property, and expectations, but left no space for the quiet moments that had somehow changed his life during only 2 conversations. He opened the folder again and noticed one final blank page reserved for additional conditions requested by the king. Taking up his fountain pen, Ethan hesitated for several long moments before writing only one sentence in his own careful handwriting. Both people shall remain free to speak honestly, even when the truth is ordinary. He stared at the words before setting the pen aside. They looked strangely simple compared to the legal language filling every previous page, yet they mattered more than anything else inside the agreement. Later that afternoon, Chancellor Marcus entered the study expecting to collect the completed documents. He noticed the king still sitting quietly beside the open folder. "Has something changed, Your Majesty?" Ethan looked toward the palace gardens where white daisies swayed gently in the autumn breeze outside his window. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I have." Marcus accepted the folder and carefully reviewed the handwritten edition. A warm smile slowly appeared beneath his silver mustache. "This is not the sort of condition lawyers usually write." Ethan returned a faint smile of his own. "Perhaps that is why it belongs there." The Chancellor closed the folder respectfully before asking the question he had quietly carried for days. "Shall I prepare the formal proposal for Miss Carter?" Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the open window where crisp autumn air drifted gently through the room. He thought about forgotten breakfasts, flowers turned toward the sun, notebooks filled with thoughtful habits, and conversations that had somehow made a palace feel less lonely. At last he nodded. "Yes." His voice remained calm, but certainty had quietly replaced duty. "Send the invitation." Far away, unaware that a royal messenger had already begun preparing for another journey, Emily carefully folded warm loaves of bread into woven baskets for families across her village, believing tomorrow would arrive much like every ordinary day before it, never imagining that before another sunset, someone would place an envelope upon her doorstep carrying not simply the future of a kingdom, but the beginning of a home neither she nor the Alpha King had ever expected to find. The royal messenger arrived just before sunset, finding Emily kneeling beside her little herb garden as she carefully gathered fresh rosemary before the evening chill settled across the village. She accepted the sealed envelope with the same quiet gratitude she offered everyone, thanking the courier before carrying it inside her cottage. Golden light streamed through the kitchen window as she broke the royal seal and unfolded the carefully written invitation. It was not a command. It was not a contract. It was a simple request asking whether she would return to Blackwood Palace to discuss a future together built upon honesty, partnership, and mutual respect. Emily read the letter slowly before her eyes rested on one handwritten sentence added beneath the official text. I hope you will continue reminding me to notice the ordinary things. She smiled without realizing it. The following morning she stood once more beneath the towering gates of Blackwood Palace, though this visit felt remarkably different. The palace no longer seemed hurried. Fresh flowers brightened every hallway. Warm bread rested upon breakfast tables while servants laughed quietly together as they worked. The little changes were subtle, yet unmistakable. Emily realized they had not happened because someone had ordered them. They had happened because one person had begun paying attention. Ethan waited inside the same reception room where they had first shared tea. The white daisies still stood beside the window, now blooming more brightly than before. As Emily entered, he rose immediately, not out of royal custom but simple respect. They greeted one another with easy smiles that no longer felt uncertain. For a few moments neither of them reached for the documents resting upon the table. Instead, Ethan poured fresh tea into 2 cups, making certain this time that it was still warm before placing one before Emily. She noticed the quiet gesture and smiled. You remembered. Ethan nodded. Someone reminded me that little things matter. Emily looked toward the neatly prepared folder resting beside him. Is that the agreement? She asked gently. Ethan placed one hand upon the leather cover before answering. It was. He slowly opened the folder, revealing the carefully written contract inside. Emily noticed his handwritten sentence about honesty resting near the final page and felt a quiet warmth spread through her heart. Before she could speak, Ethan carefully lifted the completed document with both hands. Then, without hesitation or ceremony, he folded it once, then again, before setting it aside untouched. He looked directly into Emily's calm blue eyes. When I first began this search, he said softly, I believed I needed someone to organize my schedule, manage my household, and help steady the kingdom. His voice remained gentle, carrying none of the authority expected from a king. Then you quietly reminded me that homes are not built by perfect plans. They are built by people who notice when someone has forgotten to eat breakfast, who turn flowers toward the sunlight, and who remember birthdays no one else remembers. Emily listened in complete silence, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed a simple silver wedding band that reflected the warm afternoon light. He placed it gently upon the wooden table between them instead of immediately offering it to her. A faint smile appeared across his face, warmer and more natural than any he had worn before. I thought I was looking for someone practical, he said. Instead, I found someone who made this palace feel alive again. Emily looked from the ring to the man sitting across from her. She realized she had never tried to change him. She had only treated him the same way she treated everyone else, with patience, honesty, and quiet care. Sometimes that was enough to change everything. Outside the open window, white daisies swayed gently beneath the autumn sun while laughter drifted across the palace gardens. For the first time in many years, the Alpha King did not hear another report waiting to be signed or another responsibility calling his name. He heard only the peaceful silence of a place that finally felt like home, and as Emily's smile quietly answered his own, both of them understood that the happiest chapters of their story had not ended there. They had only just begun.